All right, guys, we're going to continue our discussion about the Greek gods and goddesses and some of the mythology that follows along. So remember, you have that sheet that you need to fill out with the 3 columns, the names of the gods and goddesses, the sphere of influence, and of course the symbol/animal. And we talked a little bit about that, so be sure to be filling that out. Now, when we left off yesterday, we were talking about Hephaestus. Now, Hephaestus was the god of blacksmiths and fire, so that's where we left off. Now what we're going to move on to is Athena. Now, Athena has actually a very kind of weird story about how she came about. Now, Athena, or Minerva to the Romans, was the goddess of wisdom and war. Now, she's more known for being the goddess of wisdom than she is war. Now, the way she came about was weird. Zeus was being unfaithful again to Hera. Shocker, I know. But he fell in love with the Titaness Metis. Now, Metis was the Titaness of wisdom. And they were going to have a child together. Now, Zeus heard a very familiar prophecy. He heard that this child would actually be more powerful than he was, and he did not want any part of that. Now, kind of like his father and the prophecy that he heard about him, he did not want any of his children to be more powerful than him and take away his throne. So he kind of did the same thing as what Kronos did. He actually turned Metis into a fly and swallowed her so that the child would not be born. Now, this is how they explained how Zeus became so wise, because he swallowed the Titaness of wisdom, which is a weird story in itself. Now, later on, Zeus had a very terrible headache, and he asked his son to do something very strange to cure that headache. He asked Hephaestus to take his hammer, whack Zeus upside the head to crack it open, and then look in there and see what was going on. Like, hey, what's going on in there? Why do I have a headache? Now, if you ever have a headache, don't whack each other upside the head with a hammer. That will not cure your headache. I guarantee it. I'm not a doctor, but I can guarantee that it won't work, okay? So anyway, when Hephaestus cracked the skull open, out popped Athena. And Zeus said, hey, this was my daughter, Athena, and that's how she became the goddess of wisdom and war. Now, Athena was never married. Even though she's the goddess of war, she liked compromise more than she did bloodshed. So she would always try to compromise before going to war, unlike her counterpart, the other god of war, the male god of war in Greek mythology, Ares, which we will talk about him in just a little bit. He was not such a nice guy. According to the mythology, she invented the flute and the olive tree, which is a very cool story about how she invented the olive tree, which actually had to do with her and another god fighting over the naming of a Greek city. She always wears armor, has gray eyes, and she carries Zeus's shield Aegis, which is in the statue right there in that picture. And her symbol is the owl. Now here's Aphrodite, or Venus to the Romans, and yes, that's how we got the name of the planet, was through the Roman name of her. Now, we talked a little bit about Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite was born from sea foam. Remember we talked about when Kronos destroyed Ouranos, drops of blood fell down, 3 of them created the Furies, the spirits of vengeance, and the one of them dropped into the sea, creating sea foam, and that's where Aphrodite came from, the sea foam. Well, Aphrodite is the goddess of love, and she actually had a magic belt that would make everyone fall in love with her. And sometimes she would actually lend this belt to mortals. She'd feel bad for a mortal that was so deeply in love with somebody, but the person they were in love with did not share that feeling. So she would let them borrow that belt, and they would use it, and that person would fall in love with them, and they'd live happily ever after. But she interfered sometimes with love a little too much, and it caused problems. And one legend talks about one of those problems. Now, the Trojan War was a big, huge Trojan war that was in the Greek culture, and we're going to talk about that because there's some disputes on if it really happened or not, but we'll talk about the Trojan War later. But what happened with that, and how she kind of started that war, they believed, was that there was a contest between her and some other goddesses of who was the most beautiful, and she asked a prince named Paris to judge. He was the prince of Troy, and she promised that if he voted for her, she would give him the most beautiful woman in the world at that time, and her name was Helen. And he did that, so she promised him Helen. Well, here's the problem with Helen. Helen was married to a king of Sparta. Didn't turn out too well, and that's how the whole Trojan War was the mythology of how the Trojan War started. That's how it came about. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. She was married to Hephaestus, but was not faithful. And she often had affairs with the other god named Ares. This guy. Now, Ares was the god of war, and he was involved in all warlike activities. Not a nice guy because he was very violent and was always eager to start fights, very short temper. He would also interfere with many wars any way that he could make them more bloody and violent because he liked it. That's what his hobby was, I guess. He enjoyed it. His animal was the wild boar, and his symbol was the bloody spear. This guy's was not a nice guy, and you did not want to get on this guy's bad side, according to Greek mythology. Now, this is Apollo. Now, Apollo does not have a Roman name, and because the Romans used Apollo as his name, just like the Greeks did. He was the god of the sun, and he was in charge of the sun's movement across the sky. Kind of like in Egyptian mythology, how we talked about Ra was the one that made sure that it went through the sky. Apollo was the same way. He was the god of music, the god of poetry, and archery. So those archery people, this is your guy. He invented something called the lyre, and which is his symbol. And this is what the lyre is. This thing right there. That's the lyre. Apollo also has a twin sister named Artemis, who we are going to talk about right now. Now, Artemis, or Diana to the Romans, was the moon goddess in charge of the movement of the moon across the sky, just like her brother was in charge of the movement of the sun across the sky. She was in charge of the movement of the moon across the sky at night. She was also the goddess of maidens, and what they mean by maidens is women that were not married. And the reason why she was the goddess of maidens is because she did not associate with men and did not get married. She was always single. She was the protector of animals and small children. So she would protect small children. And she was also had kind of the silver glow, kind of like the moon does whenever she would be seen, and drove a chariot led by a stag. And what a stag is basically a male deer, a buck. She was an archer as well, like her brother, but she had 100% accuracy. That meant she never, ever missed her target. And like I said, she was a twin sister of Apollo, and her symbol was a female bear. Okay? Now that's where we're going to stop today with the twins of Apollo and Artemis. And we'll continue on Monday. So be sure to keep these sheets safe, and we will continue then.